said in Parliament that Calcutta was a dying city and there'd been a huge uproar about it. Dominique Lapierre had written a book called City of Joy, whose basic thesis was these people are very poor but they're happy, ha ha ha, which was also, I don't think, a great advertisement for Calcutta. So I chose, I think, against the odds to come to Calcutta. I had lived in Bombay. I had job offers in Bombay. I knew Delhi well. But something about Calcutta attracted me. So I called Avik Sarkar, who I had only known by reputation as the owner of Anand Bazaar Patrika. And he said, come to Calcutta and come and see me. So I said, okay, what is the address of your office? And ABP then was really riding high. Apart from the main paper, there was Sunday, there was Business World, Sports World. The Telegraph was then, as now, the top paper in the city. And he said, you're in Calcutta. Ask anyone where ABP is. Everybody knows. We are one of the world's great media institutions. So I said, fine. So I got out of the Grand where I was staying, and I got a taxi. And I said to the guy, will you take me to Anand Bazaar Patrika? The guy had no idea what that was, had no idea where the office was. Then the doorman at the Oberoi told him, you know, big media organization, not far from here, etc. So the guy appeared to get it eventually. So I got into this car, and he drove me to this really impressive, from Central Avenue, this really impressive building. And so we drove up, and I was very impressed. So maybe Avik was right. So I went to the guy at reception, and I said, where does Avik Sarkar sit? So the guy looked at me like I was mad. And I asked another person, nobody knew. Then one very kindly man came to me and said, Avik Sarkar works for ABP. You have been brought to the Statesman. So unfortunately for me, I had misunderstood everything. Fortunately, ABP was not far. So I walked then, and I got into Prafulla Sarkar Street, and I went into the Anand Bazaar office, and I was late. And I explained to Avik Sarkar what had happened. And he looked at me like I was a cretin, and it was all my fault. So that was my introduction to Calcutta and to ABP.
Well, you survived, and you had a long career.
I flourished, I survived.
Yeah, and you thrived.
Yeah.
But coming, you said, you know, you were familiar with Bombay and Delhi.
Yeah.
Coming from Bombay, was there a culture shock, a newsroom in Kolkata?
Yeah, I think, well, Calcutta is very different now. In fact, when I drive in from the airport, I don't recognize it. The old bypass and the old things that we used to take no longer are anything like I remember them. But Calcutta was very, very different from Bombay. For a start, I think Bombay is pretty much a typical Indian city, but Calcutta is an Indian city, tripled, squared, whatever. It's pretty much an assault on the senses in terms of the sounds, the sights, the smells. It's also unlike Bombay, which is a much more cosmopolitan city. At least in 1986, Calcutta was a very great Bengali city. And people used to say that Calcutta has this wonderful cultural life, there's theater, there's poetry, all of which was true. But they didn't tell me that if you don't speak Bengali, you can't be part of this cultural life. So,
You were the dreaded non-Bengali.
oh, yeah, I was, yeah. And Anand Bazaar, in those days, everybody spoke to each other in Bengali. I was always made to feel like the outsider. And Calcutta was very, very insular and very much more bong than it is today. I remember that during Puja, now I'm used to coming from a place where on a public holiday you close a newspaper down for a day or so. For Puja, all of ABP would shut down for 8 days. Nobody would come to work. There would be no papers. One little guy would come, sit in the operator's cabin, and if you phoned, he would pick up the phone, shout, Pujo, and then hang up again. There was no hope of getting any further. So all this coming from Bombay was strange for me.
So now when you come back to Kolkata, are there any food must-haves on your checklist?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Calcutta is actually two different cities when it comes to food. Bongs get very angry when I say this. There's Bengali cuisine, which is, of course, a very sophisticated and advanced cuisine. I have to say that because I get into trouble if I don't in Calcutta. And then there's the cuisine of Calcutta, which is not Bengali necessarily. No, the chaat in Calcutta, which according to me is probably the best in the world. The puchkas in Calcutta are better than the puchkas anywhere else. But that's not Bengali. If you go and meet these chaatwalas, they're Biharis, some are from UP. So it's the attraction of Calcutta as a center to these guys. The roll, which is now called the Kathi roll and is served all over India, which was called the Nizam's roll when I was here. That's not invented by Bongs. That was also invented by Biharis who came to Calcutta. So much, or the Calcutta biryani, which Bengalis will tell you was invented by Wajid Ali Shah and cooks from Awadh who put potatoes in it because potatoes were very rare and expensive in those days. And all that whole mythology, even that is not really Bengali food. So there are two completely distinct cuisines. What's happened is that the cuisine of Calcutta has spread far and wide, but Bengali cuisine has not got the recognition it deserves.
So what is the most overrated food here?
In Calcutta?
Yeah.
Smoked hilsa. I hate hilsa. Every time I tell a bong that I don't want to eat ilish, they look like you're going to slap me. But honestly, I don't like ilish. I just don't like it.
Well, I mean, one of the things you write about in the book is when you are editing the magazine, when you work in Bombay, and you start writing restaurant reviews, and you say we were consistently rude about everything.
Yeah.
And nobody in India had ever been nasty about hotel restaurants before. And people wanted sharp, critical reviews of restaurants that they could trust. Now it seems to me sometimes that we are back in the age.
Full circle.
Full circle.
360 degrees.
Yeah.
Yeah, in those days, I mean, there weren't that many top restaurants. There weren't that many hotels. The only good hotel in Calcutta till the Taj opened in the 90s was the Grand, right? Now there's so many of them. So it was not different in Bombay, where there were like 2 or 3 good hotels and few restaurants. Is that because people were journalists, we were not very well paid, we enjoyed going to these restaurants and not paying the bill. So as a result, journalists were never unkind about restaurants. But I thought that, we're now talking about 79, 80, that there was a new class of people who liked food, who wanted actual information about what's good, what's bad. So we started doing bad reviews, and we picked on like the top restaurants of the day, most of which were crap, let's be honest, and overpriced. And we started going for them and saying, Bhel Puri is the great Bombay invention. All the stuff you get these expensive restaurants is not good. And initially, as you say, they didn't take very well to it, but I think we launched a trend. Now, unfortunately, with the mainstream media in decline, nobody will offer to pay for meals if journalists eat in restaurants to review them. So journalists are back to being freeloaders. What is worse is the creation of this whole blogger category. I don't know how many of you are in the business, but here's how it works. If you open a restaurant tomorrow and you want people to know, you will be asked to hire an agency. Then they'll be called a PR agency or a social media agency. Then some young, very self-assured person will come and see you and say, no problem, etc. We will get you influencers. So then you will be asked to host a free dinner, and about 30 to 40 people who know nothing about food will come to your restaurant, will have dinner. Then they'll go away. Then the agency will come and see you again and say, we'll be able to pay the influencers. It'll cost you what? 40,000, 60,000. So you will pay the agency. The influencers will be paid. They will do Instagram posts. They'll do things on Facebook saying how wonderful your food is. And that's become what passes for food criticism these days.
So, but does it work? I mean, people are not fools. I mean, people read these and do they trust what a food influencer says, knowing that's the price of a free meal?
Yeah, it's changing. I think in America and England, there's a lot of mistrust of food influencers because it started the same way as it did in India. But no, in India, it's easy. I mean, you can become the leading food critic in India tomorrow, open an Instagram account, buy yourself 10,000 followers, 20,000 followers. It doesn't cost much. Approach a few agencies and what? You are the most famous critic in India. People believe it, unfortunately.
Do you feel that sometimes the success you had on television,
Yeah.
talking about food, bringing food to mainstream audiences, has in some indirect way spawned the influencers who also wanted to replicate some of that success?
No, I wish that was true, but I can't take any of the credit. I don't think I started a trend. I think I saw a trend. I saw the middle class being more interested in travel, more interested in food, and I jumped on the back of the trend. I didn't start it.
I'm going to go back in time. One of the fascinating things about the book A Rude Life is you get to see how Vir Sanghvi started out. And it's fascinating because you're not even 20, you're at Oxford studying. India Today has started out. You're kind of moonlighting for them, writing articles on the side. And, you know, by the time you've turned 20, you've interviewed like Sting, George Harrison, Raj Kapoor, all kinds of people. Didn't it go to your head?
No, I mean, it should have, but it didn't. I think there was a sense in which one reason I became a journalist, and I could have done other things, I suppose, is that it gave you the chance to meet different people. It gave you a chance to spend time with some of the most famous people in India, if not the planet. You saw them up close, you learned what they were like, and no 2 days were the same. Everything was different. So that attracted me. So I never actually felt that there was anything wonderful about me because, say, George Harrison would talk to me about his problems with Eric Clapton or whatever. It just, I suppose in some sense, I was just a groupie. I was just enjoying it too much.
Well, you say about the George Harrison interview, in fact,
Yeah.
that the editor, whoever was doing in the India Today, they weren't that into the Beatles, I guess. So a lot of stuff got left out.
Yeah.
And he said, we had it all on record, and we wasted it. So what was some of the stuff that got wasted?
Okay, this was in 1976. The Beatles had broken up in around 1971. All of them were in court suing each other. John Lennon had given many interviews saying how much he hated Paul McCartney. The others had not spoken. George Harrison in particular had not spoken. So nobody really knew why the Beatles had broken up or what had happened. But, you know, sitting in a hotel suite in Bombay, and this is pre-internet, pre-everything, he felt so far removed from London, from all the problems he was having, that he was willing to open up and he was willing to talk about what had happened. And I mean, all of it now is reasonably well known. He talked about his wife, Patty, and how behind his back she had an affair with Eric Clapton and how she ran off with Eric Clapton. And he just produced an album called 33 and a Third, on which he did you'll know the old Everly Brothers song, Bye Bye Love, which Simon and Garfunkel covered on Bridge Over Troubled Water. He did a very bitter version of, you know, There Goes My Baby with someone new, There Goes My Baby with you know who. So he talked quite a lot about that. He talked about how much he hated Paul McCartney. He talked about how strange it was to have had all that money and all that fame. And this is, remember, we're talking about a different period. The only person who'd come close, he said, to achieving that kind of status was Elton John. And unfortunately, he said Elton John was a fool, so he didn't know how to enjoy any of it. So all of this journalistically was gold. He said about David Bowie, I mean, he was a bit conservative. You can tell why he went to the Hare Krishna movement. He said about David Bowie, he should first make up his mind what sex he is, then decide what he wants to cover. He said about Pete Townsend, he said he talks about gurus and all that. Every time I've met him, he's been pissed out of his mind. He said about Rod Stewart that his music has improved since Tom Dowd started producing his albums. But honestly, that guy, his brain is the size of a marble. So it was really unguarded stuff that you'd never have got, most of which I think they left out in the interview.
Tragic.
Yeah.
But I'm glad we get to get a little bit of it here. Yeah. You said, you know, surprisingly, it should have gone to your head, but it didn't, that you were meeting all these famous people. But, you know, you were so young at that time. Did it at least increase your value on the dating market?
No, I mean, I say this with a certain amount of sadness, but I had a girlfriend at the time, and I had a girlfriend who, I was in Oxford, but she was in India, and we remained boyfriend, girlfriend, till I finished at Oxford, came back to India, actually realized what we were like, and promptly broke up. But during that whole period, nothing.
When you could have been like, oh, I'll get, you know, come and hang out with Sting if you date me. But
yeah. But those opportunities, alas, never arose. Oh, hang out with Amitabh Bachchan, that also counted for something. Nothing happened. I never tried that line.
Now, you were also there at another very historic moment when India Today did its first sex survey, which became this annual thing
Sex on the Campus.
Sex on the Campus.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about you. And you read it and you thought the survey was bullshit, basically.
Yeah, I mean, it was a survey on sex on the campus. It was somebody had this bright idea. I assume Time or Newsweek did it, which is why India Today did it. They hired this agency to go into a survey, and the survey took the form of these guys going into campus. We're talking, what, late 70s, early 80s, and going up to girls and saying, how often do you have sex every week? So what are they going to say? They said, we don't have sex. So you ended up with, I think, some absurd figure which said that 12% of students on campus who were male and had sex, and 1% of women. So obviously, either you had very hardworking 1%, or you had people lying. So the latter was clearly the case. So it was an idiotic thing to do, but the issue sold out anyway.
Do you think sex surveys have gotten better? Are they more believable now?
Sex surveys? I don't know. I always kind of feel left out when I read them, so I have no idea.
Yeah, because you read things like, and it says Lucknow is the threesome capital of India, and you're like, really?
Yeah, I mean, every time I go, they give me a puchka and a kebab. That's all I ever get.
Now, you've had, because of all the different people you've interviewed, you've had quite a ringside view on many of the things we've read about. And I thought, because this is a lit fest, I'd get you to tell the story of Salman Rushdie and Satanic verses and the huge uproar that happened, because it also involves someone who's been here to this lit fest, Shravani Basu.
Okay. Well, I knew Salman Rushdie because he'd come to India right after the success of Midnight's Children, and I knew him, he'd come home, etc. And then I went to London and I met him just when Shame was coming out, so I knew a bit about that. And then he did the Satanic verses. And I had a bit of a ringside seat because Penguin in those days was part of ABP. Avik Sarkar was, I think, apart from Penguin, the single largest shareholder. And Penguin's consulting editor then was Khushwant Singh. And Khushwant Singh read the manuscript and said, you can't publish this. This book is very offensive to Muslims. So Penguin was then stuck with Khushwant's opinion. Remember, Khushwant then was very well respected, his opinion taken seriously. So Penguin India wondered what to do, and the case went to Avik Sarkar, who was told that if you publish this book and you do an Indian edition, you lose money, the book will be banned. And Avik Sarkar, to his eternal credit, said, I'm in the business of publishing books, not banning books. We'll go ahead and publish. But before that could happen, Salman started doing interviews to publicize the book. So Shravani Basu, who you mentioned, was then the ABP correspondent in London, and she went to interview Salman. So I briefed her. I said, there's going to be hell to pay in India. Is he aware of that? So after he'd finished telling us what a great book it was and what the plot was and all that usual publicity nonsense, she asked him, she said, aren't you worried about the response to the book? So he said, why? So she said, you know, there will be protests and all that. So at which Salman got to his loftiest and said, it's a funny view of the world to think that a book can cause riots, ha, ha, ha. Sort of famous last words. The interview came out. Sayyid Shahabuddin, who was then a powerful member of parliament, read the interview. And then India Today carried an extract, an innocuous extract, but it carried one. He read that. He called for a ban on the book. Many other Muslim MPs who had not read the book also called for a ban. At this stage, nobody had read the book. The demand for the ban went to the government of Rajiv Gandhi, who asked his home minister what they should do. His home minister then was some of older people will remember him, the noted intellectual Sardar Bhutta Singh, who said, sir, ban kar dijiye. So then, without anybody having read the book, on the basis of the Shravani's interview and an extract, and these idiotic demands from Shahabuddin and co., the book was banned, which I think tells us something about how little respect there was for literature in those days, and it's even worse now.
Now, in hindsight, do you regret briefing Shravani Basu?
No, look, somebody or the other would have said it. Look, all these things have take on a life of their own. Right. In the case of the Satanic verses, there was the Indian ban. The Indian ban went to people heard about in Pakistan, where the book had not been released. There were demonstrations against the British Embassy, the British High Commission, and people attacked the British Council building. Footage of the attack on the British Council building in Pakistan was shown on television all over the world. Ayatollah Khomeini saw that, and he apparently asked somebody, what are they protesting? And he was told that a man has written a book against the Prophet. And he said, oh, issue a fatwa against him. So that's how things, they just take on a life of their own. If it hadn't been the Shravani interview, there would have been something else.
Yeah. One of the things that's really fascinating here when you talk about the various people you've interviewed, you're talking about Bal Thackeray, and you write, Bal Thackeray is one of the few politicians I enjoyed spending time with, even when you didn't agree with a lot of his politics. How did you learn to separate the person from the politics, which I think we increasingly, especially in this age of social media, find it harder to do?
Yeah, you know, oddly enough, I never had any difficulty doing it. Remember that we're talking about the 1970s. We'd just come out of the emergency. So it was not possible to like anybody in the Congress. Mrs. Gandhi, in my mind, was a villainous figure because she'd locked up the opposition. Sanjay Gandhi was just a gunda. So who were you going to like? You had to start out on the assumption that all politicians were evil, venal, or crooks. Yet you're going to have to write about them. You're going to have to meet them. So you have to decide that among these venal, evil people, who is fun to have a beer with? And Bal Thackeray made the grade.
Well, here's a quiz question for you, for the audience.
Okay.
When we're talking about politicians, this is Vir Sanghvi describing a politician in his early days. The adjectives he uses are relaxed, jovial, approachable, humble, and unself-conscious. Shout out, who do you think he's talking about?
Who?
Rajiv Gandhi. Anything else? Lalu Prasad. One more.
That's a new one. Okay.
Atal Bihari Vajpayee, someone said.
Okay.
Tell us who it was.
You know, frankly, I've forgotten.
I'll tell you. It is Narendra Modi in his early days.
Yeah. The sort of shock on the faces of the audience tells you how hard this is to believe now. But honestly, he was a very different person.
So, but how, you know, when you interviewed somebody who is already, at that time, of course, Narendra Modi is not so famous, so...
No, he was just a general secretary of the BJP.
So you used to hang out with him?
Well, hang out means he used to come to Arun Jaitley's house. I would meet him there. I had a television show. I would invite him. He would come there. Before the show, he would hang out in the green room, joke with people. You could make fun of him and not get shot. I mean, he was quite happy to chat with everyone.
But how do you approach an interview with someone who is already very famous and who's been interviewed many, many times? And isn't one of the concerns that at some level, when it's someone famous, that you want to be liked by them?
No, it's yes, but no also. What you want to do, at least the way I do it, many people, when they interview somebody, start shouting at him and are very aggressive. The man or woman then goes into a shell and gives you answers on autopilot. But the interviewer comes away, I ask questions, I don't care, yaar, as a big hero. So that's not my style. My style is that when you're interviewing somebody who's famous, the chances are that every obvious question you're going to ask him or her, they've already answered. That the answers, you just sort of press a button and they'll come up with the same answers. So what can you do to be different? Well, if it's somebody who's a big liar, you can confront them with the truth and catch them out in contradictions. But more often than not, the trick is to get them relaxed, to make them forget that there are cameras around them. And if they are relaxed, they will often say things that they would never dreamt of having said. And you'll get something new. So you need to be liked by them in the course of the interview for them to feel comfortable. But after that, I mean, I don't hang out with these guys. I don't really care.
So can you give an example?
Of people?
Of someone, you know, who gets relaxed and then they say something that surprised you.
Oh, Christ. Okay. Various people have said all kinds of things to me that George Harrison was one example. Amitabh Bachchan, I think, who's normally got this very sort of buttoned up and monosyllabic persona. If you get him relaxed in an interview, when he was, some of you may remember this, there was a phase in his life when he was bankrupt, when he owed 100 and something crores. His own house had been attached by the bank. And he didn't really talk about it because he's a very dignified man. So I got him then to talk about it, which was, I thought, a first. And then when he made it again, I got him to talk about what it was like during that down phase. And his official position was that there was never a down phase. I was okay. But he actually said, and I thought it was very gutsy of him to say that, he said, I owed so much money. Everybody had given up on me. I had no films on hand. There was nothing I could do. I wouldn't sleep at night. Then one morning, I said, there's no point, just to myself, there's no point, he said, lying around doing nothing in bed. So he got up, he had a bath, he got dressed. He walked to Yash Chopra's house, which wasn't very far from his. And Yash Chopra was there, was surprised to see him. And he said, I have no films on hand. I have no money. I have nothing. Can you cast me in a film? And they cast him in Mohabbatein, which is how the comeback began. But it's not the kind of story he tells very often. So when you get people relaxed, these things come out. And ultimately, people remember. I always think the mistake interviewers make is thinking that people switch on for them. They don't switch on for us. They switch on for the guest, right? So if you can get the guest to say something different, something that wouldn't be said before or wouldn't be said again, then you've got a good interview.
Yeah, one of the things I found quite moving in some of the anecdotes you talk about in terms of the people is actually when you're talking to another person famously difficult to interview, Jaya Lalita, and when you ask her, and she has just broken up with, Shashikala has moved out, and she actually says something quite moving about Shashikala.
Yeah, this is what, 1996, 97. She'd lost the chief ministership. Her loss had been blamed on Shashikala, and many scurrilous things were said about her relationship with this lady. And Shashikala had, as you said, moved out, and she had publicly disowned her. So I asked her about Shashikala, imagining that she would take the public position. Instead, her eyes filled with tears and said, I have never had a better companion in my life than Shashikala. So sometimes you get the odd things from them. And I knew then that this was all fake and that Shashikala would be back. And she was back. I remember asking her about MGR. I mean, the public legend has that she was in love with MGR. MGR groomed her. In actual life, it came through. She said MGR was jealous of her. She had no affection left for MGR.
Now, when you're talking to these powerful figures, so how do you guard yourself from being played by them, where you feel like they might be using you to, or basically playing you because using you as a conduit?
But you're playing them, no?
True.
You don't really care about them. You don't really care whether Jayalalitha and Shashikala kiss and make up or never see each other again. You're trying to play them to get your quotes. So obviously they're going to do the same thing and try and get what they want from me. I remember Arun Nehru, who I had attacked non-stop when he was with Rajiv Gandhi and after. He was Commerce Minister in the VP Singh government, and he asked if I, through a mutual friend, if I would do an interview with him. So I was freaked out, but I went. And he began talking about the Commerce Ministry, a subject in which I had zero interest. And I kept wondering, why has this man called me? And then I asked him sort of the key question, saying, are you in touch with Rajiv Gandhi? Because remember, Rajiv was then out of power, and VP Singh had launched all these investigations against them, and people said that Rajiv and Sonia would go to jail. So he said, yeah, I meet him all the time. Why? I just met him yesterday. So he'd basically done the interview to send a message to VP saying that he could go back to the Congress. So in that sense, he was playing me. From my perspective, I had a scoop. So there is an element of mutual playing.
Now, I want to ask you about a period that was very difficult for you when the Radia tapes came out, which you write about in the book. And you write about 8 years when you filed a lawsuit against Outlook magazine for putting you and other journalists on the cover. They issue a clarification eventually. You had the tapes tested by external agencies and concluded that they were doctored. But forgetting the 2G scam or Anant Kumar, I don't know how many people remember all the details about it. It just created the perception that journalists wrote what people like Neera Radia was telling them to.
Yeah.
Was that fair?
No, not really. I mean, what is fair is that many industrialists planted stories in newspapers. I mean, let's take the Radia tapes, for example. I mean, you pretty much told the whole story, so I'm not going to tell it again. But effectively, Neera Radia, who was PR person for Mukesh Ambani and Ratan Tata, had her phones tapped by the finance ministry on the grounds that somebody had written the finance ministry an anonymous letter saying that how has this woman made so much money. On that basis, they tapped her phones for 6 months. I mean, that tells you a bit about what kind of surveillance state we had in India long before Mr. Modi and Mr. Amit Shah came along. It's always been there. That's pretty much bad enough. After that, these tapes were made available to industrialists who were able to use them for their own purposes, and industrialists who the laws of libel prevent me from naming, who had perhaps been instrumental in getting the taps organized anyway, took the tapes, now we know, because the CBI has said this also, doctored them, released them, planted them in Outlook and other sort of dupe media, also then took thumb drives with some of the tapes. There were like several thousand conversations that they picked under 100, did typescripts of each of those conversations, transcripts, which were also edited, and sent them to every newspaper office. It seemed like a scandal. Newspapers ran it. It became a scandal. So if you want to know how the media gets suckered in corporate battles, this is one example. And how little the media bother to check anything. So the tapes, the CBI told the Supreme Court, quite apart from my own labs, which I had hired, were doctored. And yet the media went with them again and again, all because they were victims, because we were victims of a corporate war.
But the larger take also is, do you think that that whole incident damaged credibility because people looked at it, and what they took away was that this is too cozy a club. Media, politicians, industrialists are all in each other's pockets. It's one cozy club, and that is why there is so much corruption in this country.
It's interesting you say that, because there were several agendas at work. The industrialist who leaked the tapes, his agenda was to destroy Ratan Tata and Mukesh Ambani through Neera Radia. But once the tapes came out, none of us had heard then of the IT cell. We were on Twitter, which was a very innocent place then, and we believed that the tweets that were put out were done by normal people. We didn't realize that there were bots, that there were troll factories, that many of the people who were tweeting didn't really exist. And then various BJP-type IT cells in India and abroad started tweeting this message again, saying that journalists are determining cabinet posts. There was nothing of that kind on the tapes, but who bothers to read the actual tapes? That journalists are controlling India on behalf of industrialists, and it's all, as you say, a corrupt, cozy club. Get rid of this corrupt, cozy club that the UPA has created. Create a new India, elect Mr. Modi, and usher in a new era of communal harmony. I think then that message went through.
So what's the lesson you've taken from that whole episode, which in terms of, I mean, in hindsight, is there something you regret?
No, I mean, I regret having not learned enough about social media. So I regret believing that the tweets were genuine, that the Twitter storm that was created was genuine. If you now, I mean, some of you are on Twitter, if you go on to the trending section and you see what is trending, it's either things that have been paid for by companies or movies, or it's idiotic, bogus trends like Farooq Abdullah, murderer, or whatever. All of these are really created by IT cells, by troll farms. We didn't know that. So when the attack came on me, on Barkhadat, and a few others, I think we were very depressed, we were very upset, and we said, my God, people think this about us. We didn't know then it wasn't people, it was troll farms. So I regret not knowing that, and I regret being offended.
Now, one of the things is also, because at that time, you people like you and Barkhadat were celebrity journalists in a certain way. I'm not saying celebrities who were journalists, but journalists who had also become celebrities.
And we are not now?
You are still.
I rest my case.
But my question is
Yeah.
does that point to one of the dangers of when the journalist becomes the news?
Well, I think that's the only time in my life when I've become part of the story. I think Barkha became part of the story at the Kargil occasion because what she did was unusual for a young female reporter to go into a bunker. So I think she became part of the story in the way, say, Christian Amanpour becomes part of the story. But it's not just India, all over the world. People who are not journalists so much, but television anchors, because people see them in their living rooms every day. They get a certain familiarity with them. They feel they're better than the average journalist, and they're celebrities. So I think that's one of the perils of being on television.
Well, I'm going to open this up to questions, but since you brought up television, I wanted to ask you, since you talk about this kind of fake sense of intimacy that television actually creates between the audience and the anchor, how did you have to reinvent yourself, or did you have to reinvent yourself when you went to television from being print?
No. Well, no, not really, because I'm not good, I mean, contrary to what you might think now, I'm not good in front of live audiences. I was, for instance, extremely nervous when I came on before this session. But in a television studio, it's just you and the guest and various camera people. So there's not much to be nervous about. It is, in a sense, intimate to the extent that any television studio can be intimate. It's not like being in a live thing. The television I did then, and the television, I think it still happens in news television, still happens in most of the world, was that you talk to your guest as though there is no audience, as though there are no cameras. And you create a certain sense of intimacy with the guest, which gets the guest to open up. And even when you speak to camera, you speak conversationally, like maybe I'm speaking to you now. What's changed, I think, in the last 8 or 9 years in television is that anchors no longer in India follow the global trend of being conversational. If you watch some of the news channels and count the number of times the phrase, ladies and gentlemen, is being used, there is a sense more of the circus or the tamasha than there is of a television show. The great contribution of India to news television is to overturn the rules. Everybody is always conscious that they are talking to the audience, that they're trying to lecture the audience, hector the audience, or even shout at the audience. So many of the performances you see on news television are fake. These are people who want to impress the audience, so they rave, they rant, they shout, they do things that would consider them to be lunatics on most television channels abroad. But it works in India. It's like Hindi cinema in the old days. Now Hindi cinema has changed, but in the old days, people used to complain that a movie, went to see a Hollywood movie, there would be a beginning, a middle, or an end. In Hindi cinema, the plot would come in the second half, there'd be a lot of dancing, there'd be a lot of singing. It's because while Hollywood took its cue from the novel, and then therefore, or the play, and did things that were logical, Hindi cinema took its cues from tamasha. It wanted to be an entertainment for the evening, which had dancing, singing, comedy, etc. I think that's now true of Indian television as well. People don't watch it for news. People don't watch it for arguments. They watch it for entertainment, and the anchors give them that tamasha.
Well, since you've talked about the audience, perfect time to take a couple of quick questions from the audience. So if you can get your hand up, we'll get a mic to you. If you could be brief, and just a question, okay?
I hope your mic works.
Your mic luck has sort of rubbed on.
Yeah, I think so.
Sir, you must have done so many interviews.
Yeah.
Do you have any regret that you could not interview somebody?
Yeah, I regret now that I can't interview Mr. Modi, because I don't think you can interview Mr. Modi at the moment unless you go through a long process of being approved, vetted, sending questions in advance, which is not something I would do. So, yeah, I regret that. I think every prime minister needs to face the media, needs to be asked tough questions.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, good evening, Vir. I want to ask you, during your career as a journalist, was there any moment when you faced that you could not, publish or write something after you had done it? I mean, you had taken a bite maybe from a politician or from a film personality, but you had to edit it out because there was a request which had, come to you after that. Or in the book, maybe you wanted to write something, but you had left it out.
Only once in my life, and this was in NDTV, have I ever agreed to have something cut out. And it was a small and minor thing. It was an interview. I used to do a show called Face the Music, which had 3 different guests, sometimes 4, and a musical person. And one of the guests was an actress who said something about a video scandal involving her. And I think afterwards she regretted saying it, and she appealed to the channel. And the channel said to me, "This is hardly a matter of huge national interest. Do you mind if we take it out?" And I said, "Sure, nobody really cares. I don't want to hurt anybody, take it out." I think in my entire career, it's the only time I've agreed. Same mic problem?
Hello. Yeah, hi. So I'm a big fan of your food columns.
Thank you.
So I would like to ask you something about that. I
Yeah.
recently read that you said that Singapore is the undisputed food capital of of the Eastern world. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what do you think about India? Like, what place would the food capital of India be according to you?
You know, that's so difficult to answer because Singapore is easy to answer because apart from the hawker culture, which is, of course, phenomenal, there are also really great international restaurants, great French restaurants, great Japanese restaurants, great Italian restaurants. That's not true of India. There is, I don't think, a single great French restaurant, a single great Japanese restaurant, or a single great Italian restaurant in India. So all you really have are Indian restaurants that sometimes try and do different things, but usually do the same thing, or Indian restaurants that are called Chinese restaurants that also try and do the same thing pretty much. So we don't really have a restaurant scene that's come of age. So if you take away that aspect of it, then you're left with things like street food. I think Lucknow and Banaras are brilliant for street food. Of the major cities of India, there's Calcutta. There's nowhere else where street food really reaches world-class quality. Well, I think that's it. That's probably the food capital. Yeah.
Any other?
Hello.
Can we have yeah, go ahead.
Continuing on that food columns, from current affairs, you jumped into food journalism. I mean, was there any defining moment where you made the switch, or it was...
No, there was a very stupid moment. It was my idea. We started the Sunday supplement in the Hindustan Times when I was the editor, which eventually morphed into Brunch, which now exists as Sunday Magazine. And we're talking about 2000, 2001. And I had this view that food was going to become really big in India. It wasn't then. And I said to the editor, you have to have a food column. And as we talked about what I did in the Bombay magazine days, it had to be a food column that's irreverent, that's not an hawk to the hotels and the restaurants. That's one day you write about puchkas, the next day you write about foie gras. And they said, who will do it? And I said, I'm sure you can find somebody. And so, of course, the day came to launch it, and they hadn't found anybody. So they said, we are dropping the food column. So I said, no, I will do it under a pseudonym for the first couple of months. And in the interim, you can find somebody. So I did it initially for a long time, in 3 years or 2 years, under the pseudonym Grand Fromage, which means big cheese, because I was editor of the HT. And of course, they never bloody found anybody, and I ended up doing it, and then finally we did it under my own name. So I'm actually an accidental food journalist.
love your columns, but
Thank you so much.
We have time for one last question. So whoever has the mic. Ma'am in front, this lady or somebody has a mic already. If you have a mic, go for it. Otherwise.
Hello, sir. Good
Hi.
evening. So I would like to ask you that you just spoke about how television journalism is mostly performance now. So many journalists have shifted to YouTube for independent journalism purposes because they want to just give the truth, like Fate is Suicide is doing just the news. So do you think that independent journalism on digital platform is a better way to portray journalism now?
Oh, absolutely, without a doubt. I think what we are going to see in this century is that a few big news, I mean, it's not so unusual, just look at America. The New York Times makes money, the Washington Post makes money, but most other newspapers have struggled. The Wall Street Journal makes money, but others in small towns in America, which used to be originally 2-3 newspaper towns, became 1 newspaper towns, and are no newspaper towns because there are no newspapers. People turn for their news to the internet. Something similar is going to happen with television all over the world. At the moment, CNN and Fox, which are the big channels in America, still make money. But all surveys show that the median age of their viewers is 60 plus. So this generation will not last. The next generation that comes in India and abroad will not be devoted to existing newspapers or to existing television channels. They will look online for different options. They'll find them on YouTube, they'll find them on different kinds of platforms. It's happening to some extent in India. I now do a weekly column, for instance, for The Print, which is an online platform, and I'm astonished by the response I get, far greater than the response I got for any column I did on the editorial page of any newspaper. I think the future of journalism is long tail. It's not going to be 3-4 big media organizations in each city or country that dominate everything. It's going to be 10s, 20s, 30s of smallish outfits doing television, doing video journalism, doing print journalism, and people are going to choose between them. Because these are not huge operations and they don't have huge budgets, they don't need to be slavishly devoted to the government or to corporate sponsors. And ultimately, in many ways, the sooner this avatar of mainstream media phases out and we move to that, the better the journalism will be.
And with that, I think we've come to the end of this session. Please join me in thanking Vir Sanghvi and his memoir, A Rude Life. You'll probably be signing books after this.
I have no idea. But
I think you will be, so you can get your copy of your book signed after this. And thank you again for coming.
Yeah. Thank you, Sandip. Great to be back in Calcutta. Always different talking to Calcutta audience from anywhere else in the country. It's nice to be home. Thank you, guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, both of you. Little announcement, Vir Sanghvi will sign his book in the bookstore. Next session is a Bangla session. Kolkata Literary Meet এবং ডাক বাংলার সৌজন্যে কলকাতা লিটারেরি মিটের প্রথম বাংলা অধিবেশন শুরু হচ্ছে। কলকাতা লিটারেরি মিটের বয়স এবছর 10 বছরে পড়ল, আর ডাকবাংলা.com-এর বয়স 1 বছর। এদের মধ্যে অসমবয়সী বন্ধুত্ব রয়েছে এবং তা বেশ গাঢ় বন্ধুত্ব। এবারের এই লিট মিটের সবকটা বাংলা সেশনে তাই ডাকবাংলাও সঙ্গী। ডাকবাংলা.com একটা সাংস্কৃতিক পোর্টাল, যেখানে প্রতি সপ্তাহে নতুন সংখ্যা বেরোয়, আর তাতে থাকে গল্প, কবিতা, প্রবন্ধ, সঙ্গে বক্তৃতা, যার পোশাকি নাম ব্লগ, আর সাক্ষাৎকার, ছোট সিনেমা,